Welcome to the Panic Attack Recovery Podcast, an ongoing source of practical strategies and tips for anxiety and ADHD. We're a collaboration of former sufferers helping those currently struggling with anxiety, panic attacks, and ADHD so they can express their true competencies in life. Now, here is Matthew, your host.
Hi, it's Matthew, and thank you for joining me for another podcast. In today's podcast, I want to provide some quick tips on what you can do when you're trying to deal with that challenge that comes up in life. And I'm not talking about the large challenges that come up, like solving the crisis of humanity. I'm talking about the day-to-day challenges that we all have in our life. And one of the big saboteurs is the tendency to ruminate on past events. So I'll clarify what I mean by this. Often when we encounter a challenge in life, and I've spoken to many sufferers of anxiety and ADHD, we often are trying to solve a problem. And because we feel frustrated by the problem we're trying to solve or the challenge we're trying to deal with, we start to recall memories from the past, things that have ticked us off in the past, so to speak. In other words, things we might start to ruminate about. It seems very strange that when you're in the middle of trying to solve a problem, in other words, when you're busy trying to accomplish something, you start ruminating on things. If anything, you think it would be the opposite, that a much better time to ruminate would be when you have the time to ruminate and you're not trying to solve a problem. But that's not simply how it works for many anxiety and ADHD sufferers. Now, to be really clear, this isn't the case with everyone. Not everyone ruminates when they're trying to solve a problem. But over the years, having talked with many sufferers, I've found that this is often something that many will do. They will start to recall other things that have ticked them off. When they're ticked off, they're frustrated because they're trying to solve a current problem. The problem with this tendency really is that whenever we're trying to do something, this could be in our family life, this could be at work. An example could be you encounter a problem with your computer at work and you start getting frustrated. And for some reason, something reminds you of a past memory of something that ticked you off, either about the computer or what someone said or did to you. And you start ruminating on these things while you're trying to solve the problem. The reason I wanted to give an example from work is that you could see how if this happens throughout the day, as it does for many people, you're being distracted. So let's think about this for a second. Thinking about past slights or things that have ticked you off, in other words, ruminating, is counterproductive in general. Unless it's some sort of structured activity for some specific reason why you're wanting to recall these events, it's really not helpful. Even if you're not busy, it's not that helpful to do. However, if you're busy and you're trying to do something, it's even more counterproductive because it takes your concentration away from the present problem. So in other words, you start daydreaming, ruminating when you're trying to get your computer fixed and your mind starts to wander. And another negative thought comes up and you're daydreaming, so to speak. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, what about the present moment problem, my computer? Now I kind of give this silly example in a way because I think it's an everyday example. But that's the point I want to make. This rumination tendency happens multiple times for just basic small problems. But what happens is smaller problems then can become bigger issues, bigger impediments because you're distracted. What happens is when you put yourself in a bad mood, you start to think about things in a much more negative light. So in other words, as you recall something that ticks you off and you recall another event, you start looking at those past events in a much more negative light. Because often what will happen is once you solve the problem, you might look back and think about what you've been thinking about and daydreaming about. And you might say to yourself, that's really not that significant of an event. But yet in the moment, because you were so low in terms of your mood, you really kind of judge those situations as you sort of magnified the significance of those situations. Now, I know this probably seems a little abstract. And for some of you who don't do this, it's a little hard to understand. But there might be others who do this, they're just not aware that they're doing it. But it's important to become aware that this tendency can arise when you hit a challenge in life. Because quite frankly, all of life involves having challenges. It keeps it interesting. But if we're not in a place to be flexible and to deal with those challenges, we can make life much more difficult. Now, the example I gave, as I said, was a simple example of a computer, but you can literally fill in the blank with all of the issues and problems that come up on a regular basis. And you can see how when you're distracted and starting to ruminate, you can make a small problem much bigger. But this does not have to be the case. And this leads me to some tips to deal with this tendency to ruminate when we encounter a challenge and we really need to problem solve. I bet you, if you think about it, you can solve many problems that you don't feel like you can solve initially. If you take a problem-solving approach that looks at troubleshooting the problem, figuring out potential solutions, etc., you can take positive steps and solve a problem. The first tip that I would provide is to become aware of this issue, this tendency to ruminate when problems arise in your life. I think a better way to describe it is the tendency to ruminate about things that have nothing to do with a challenge that has arisen in life. Another tip that I provide is to journal. I've talked many times that we should keep a journal. I'm not talking about journaling and keeping a diary of everything that happens in your life. I'm talking about journaling the big nuggets, the big things that you want to write down about in your life that are significant. And one of the things you can do is you can place this tendency to ruminate when problems arise in your journal, and by referring to your journal on a regular basis. Journaling isn't just about writing down, of course, things in your life, documenting them. It's about reviewing what you've written down and placed in your journal. So by taking what you find to be a regular challenge and reviewing your journal, you can become aware of how often this tendency comes up, and you become more mindful of when this happens. And more you will find yourself catching yourself and becoming aware of when this problem arises. And this can help you in life to problem solve through taking a better approach to problem solving. By getting rid of rumination, you are in a much better position to problem solve, and this can help you with life in general.
Thank you for listening to the Panic Attack Recovery Podcast. Make sure that you have subscribed to our podcast, and please comment and rate us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All show notes and links are accessible from our website. Please visit our site and subscribe to our free newsletter at panicattackrecovery.com. All information has been provided for educational purposes. Please consult a healthcare professional about any disorder or condition and the applicability of any information provided in this podcast.